So I'm going to be sharing my screen and sharing a lot of different rich visuals, hopefully, for sharing how we adopt a diversity, equity, and inclusion framework into our clinical work in child-parent psychotherapy. So let me go ahead and share. Okay, so hopefully now you're all seeing my slides. And I thought I would start by sharing the first opening phrases from our diversity, equity, and inclusion statement. The child-parent psychotherapy community believes that holding a diversity, equity, inclusion, and racial justice lens is central to our work as CPP trainers, supervisors, and providers. This stance is a core aspect of clinical competence and reflective practice that we seek to strengthen actively and continuously. We work to acknowledge ruptures in safety and rebuild protection. Our gaze needs to turn not only to ruptures at the family level, but also at a societal and sociocultural level, recognizing ongoing and historical oppression and trauma that too many groups have experienced. As we do this, we honor that sources of protection include cultural strengths and ancestral wisdom. So I hope that you're all holding and taking this in. And I'm going to shift very abruptly just to give a little bit of an overview from that clinical stance to also honoring that this is a rich evidence-based treatment with 5 randomized trials, thanks to the Rochester team who was joining us, who did 3 of these. And just to honor that our roots are, our first RCT was with 100% Latina immigrant mothers from Central America and Mexico. And then the rest of our randomized trials have included predominantly families of color. And so what this did is from the beginning, our roots are in thinking about culture, cultural richness, cultural strengths, cultural ways of understanding things, that it's always been part and parcel of our work. And you'll see this flowing into our objectives. So when we think about our treatment objectives, they're really things of not the goals are what do therapists do? Because in truth, that's what we control. We do not control what other people do. We hope for good outcomes, but we think about how do I show up in such a way that I am really thinking about safety in the environmental context, that I'm considering the impact of racism and historical trauma on child and family functioning as a key aspect of safety, as well as thinking about contextual risks of poverty, community violence, immigration-related risks. And how, when we're thinking about acknowledging the impact of trauma, are we really weaving in and acknowledging the impact of historical trauma? And this is not just on the families, but also on the workers, and how historical trauma affects the way we show up, how it affects our systems, how it affects our interactions. And then as we are putting things into perspective, as we're helping families to make meaning, to really think about at what points are we thinking about building bridges so that they're making meaning of historical trauma as an integrated part of their narrative, what their people have been through, and how it affects the ways what our people have been through, and how it affects the ways that we raise and parent our children, and what parts of that do we want to keep and what parts do we want to change. So that is sort of how it shows up in our goals. And what I wanted to do now, because we have 15 minutes, but I wanted to give you a taste of how we integrate this into our training. And so what I'm sharing here is what we call the child-parent psychotherapy triangle, which is one of our guiding visuals for our treatment model. And we'll start off with the right-hand side of the triangle, where you'll put behaviors and feelings, and you'll think about these are sometimes the reasons for why people come to treatment, the things that are bringing them down. What is the child doing? What are the things that in our systems we're looking to target or change? And I'll just start with a very simple kind of non-child welfare example, actually, of let's say we have a kid who has a fear of dogs. Okay, we'd say, what goes on the left-hand side of that triangle? And we'd be thinking about what is their experience? What have they been through? And I think of it as what's the pathway that they traveled that makes this fear or this behavior make total sense? And if I were to ask you, like, how many of you maybe have had a bad experience with a dog, right, where you were bitten by a dog, and then you would say, oh yeah, it makes total sense that the child has this symptom. And then we would say, oh, and what's our plan to restore the child's sense of safety, given what has happened? Sometimes that can affect their fear of like body damage. And around this, we always put protective steps and hopes. What are the good things that families are doing? What are the strengths that they come in with? And what is the hope that change is possible? So let's go from that very simple example to some more complex examples. So in child welfare, you might have a child who is always hungry and who hoards food. And what you would know is that child was found and they were severely hungry. Perhaps they had a parent who was using a lot of substances and who didn't always feed the baby on cue. Perhaps they were, left alone. And so what you would know is it would be critical to actually build, I call this the bridge of understanding, where you connect experience to functioning, because if there is a foster parent or a kinship placement, how will they understand that when they see this, oh, this makes a lot of sense that the child is doing this, right? Like they're never full. They keep asking you for food. They steal food. But if you know that this is a child who is nearly starving, you would say, oh, I completely understand that when their body feels hungry, it's scary for them, right? And so then we would make a better plan where we would be able to acknowledge what they had been through. And so in child welfare, and I just want to say, I didn't put this in my bio, but I'm actually the child of 2 child welfare workers. So growing up, I heard all the stories and I knew of the absolute importance of their work. But also in connecting, when a child moves from place to place, the system has become one of the caregivers who holds a key part of their story. And that story is what allows people to kind of lean in with empathy to that child and restore a sense of safety around this. Now, let's take a much more complex picture where it's a little confusing. So let's say that we have a child who has a lot of challenges, speech delays, overweight, frequent long temper tantrums. We're seeing a lot of emotion dysregulation, sleep problems, separation anxiety. And what we would wonder is, what is on that left side of the experience? And imagine that we found out that mom suffered from postpartum depression. And we would think about, what is it like to regulate, to help your baby when they're having the typical tantrums when you are very depressed? And what if there was a lot of conflict in the home that was also linked to the depression? And that dad, actually there was some domestic violence, dad was arrested and left the house. And we might be painting a picture of dad that might not be accurate. What if he was actually quite loving to the baby? And so when he left, that was a huge loss for the baby. And then on top of that, there was a lot of challenges with neighborhood safety. So in that same way, what we would be thinking is holding that Samson mantra of, it's not what's wrong with you, it's what happened to you, right? And you can see, oh, of course, given this experience, it would make total sense that the baby is having these challenges. So let's just think about, here you see kind of a picture of somebody having a temper tantrum, and this might be this child who at the age of 2 is really having challenges with emotion regulation. And we'd be thinking, now in our systems, one thing that they might be thinking about is we should look at the adverse childhood experiences that this child may have experienced. And if you actually sat there and counted from the picture before, you would notice that there were at least 4. Right? But what I'd like us to think about is, in CPP, we absolutely want to think about this, but we want to move beyond it. And so we'll think about, yes, there have been these things that the child has experienced and that the parent has had a lot of challenges, but let's move up a level. So we're going from the child's triangle to the caregivers. Remember, it's not what's wrong with the caregiver, it's what they've been through. And so on the right-hand side, we put those things. Mom is often depressed, irritable, socially isolated. And that actually, if you think about a waterfall, trickles down to the kid. It becomes the child's experience, right? But on the left-hand side, we want to put curiosity. And we want to put, how will the mom receive me so that I might get the right to hear her story? And what if this is her story? That actually her father was depressed and would drink, and she was separated from her dad. And so she doesn't really want her child to lose dad because she knows how important dads are. And that she was physically abused by her mother. She has had a life where actually having your body harmed has been unfortunately too common an occurrence, right? And then again, she also experienced feeling unsafe in her neighborhood. Now, what we know in infant mental health is that unfortunately a parent's experience, where you can think about, her experience of her mom preferring her siblings, her mother beat her, her father left her, that unfortunately can affect the way she sees herself in the world. And it might affect her beliefs of like, I'm not lovable, there's something wrong with me, people will abandon me. And that unfortunately might affect the way she actually interacts with her daughter. That she may fear that she's not important to her. She may fear that doesn't need her. She might even fear that she's like me, right? And that unfortunately, because of that, we often have kind of a negative bias where we pick up on those things that actually are consistent with our theory. And so she would notice, she wants her daddy more than me. She doesn't learn quickly. And she wouldn't be noticing those moments when the child was actually bidding for her, because they don't fit kind of her schema, her way of thinking. And that over time, the child might internalize that belief, might behave in ways, and that would become a cycle. Now in CPP, this is the cycle that we're looking to really change. How do we intervene? Because we know that history is not destiny, all right? But what predicts whether a parent will repeat their painful past in the next generation? And what Selma Freiberg taught us is that people who connect affect to experience, head to gut, are less likely to repeat. So if you can make meaning of your history and connect to the feelings underneath, you might then be able to say, it happened and it was wrong, and I want something different for my child. Okay. Now, what I've been doing so far, I want you to think about, here we have Bronfenbrenner's model. Okay. And I want you to notice that what I've been talking about is this layer of the family. And in truth, when we talk about adverse childhood experiences, notice that all of them are in that green layer where the family is. And again, what we want to do is to broaden our lens and to think about, what about those adverse community experiences, right? And that's a different kind of ACE. That's a contextual ACE. And then let's think about, what about atrocious cultural experiences? And that's from society to the family, both in the here and now and in history. So we're using a historical lens. And I just want to use what I just did to take it kind of back, to take it to history. And think about, in society, we have atrocious cultural experiences of genocide, slavery, colonization, denial of basic human rights, forced family separations. You're recognizing that this isn't history, this is current events also. And that we also have current systemic oppression, right, in nearly every system of care that we're looking at. And let's just take that exact same chain. So we have a cultural group experience in the United States, and actually, unfortunately, across the world, of genocide, slavery, and colonization. And in the same way that it was true for Mom, it's true for us, that unfortunately, that shapes our group models of relationships. It shapes our, as Isabel Wilkerson would call it, our caste system. It shapes our cultural norms, sanctioned oppressions of certain groups. That shapes both our expectations of other people. It shapes our expectations of ourselves. Am I lovable, valuable, capable? Do I see you? Does the U.S. see you? Does the U.S. see you as aggressive? Even when you're little, that we are more likely to view, for example, little Black boys as aggressive. And that tracks on to the history of our country. And then we think about how society selectively attunes to specific group behaviors. The stereotypes are internalized and oppressive conditions are maintained through racism, through systemic racism, through microaggressions, and this continues our path. And remember what I said, history doesn't have to be destiny. But in that same way that Selma taught us, what predicts whether or not the painful past of a country will be continued, people who connect affect to experience are less likely to repeat. So to the degree that we do not connect with the shame and the tremendous sadness and anger in some ways that this has happened, to the degree that history is lost, we are more likely to repeat. So I just want to highlight that this is one of the frameworks in child-parent psychotherapy. And as we dialogue with parents, we're looking for opportunities to think about historical trauma and how it shows up. So we actually work and we get not only the child's trauma history, but the caregivers. And we need to do that in a sacred space where people aren't running in and out, where we can truly sink. And that's important as we think about further deepening the dialogue of what does it take to do CPP in a child welfare context. And Juana here says, my mother used to beat me when she was angry. She didn't beat my sisters. And Ana, her therapist, says, that seems so hard and unfair. And Juana says, yes. And Ana says, why do you think your mother was like this with you? And Juana sighs and says, I don't know, but my sisters look like you. I have dark skin like my dad. They used to tease me and say that I was stupid, like my dad. Now, this is an incredible moment that she shared this. It's also very much of an interpersonal moment, thinking about how Anna receives this. But let's just take this up to that level. That think about
2-minute warning.
Okay. Think about that cultural group experience. So Juana is originally from Guatemala. She's of Mayan ancestry. And if you think about the history of colonialism, civil war, and Mayan genocide, where to be indigenous puts you at higher risk of being dead, and her skin color puts her and her family at higher risk at that time period when she was growing up, because 200,000 people of Mayan ancestry were killed. You can see that then you have this cultural group history of the racism and colorism, right? And then that trickled down to the way her mother was with her, which is unjust and unfair. But as we think about how do we adopt a racial justice lens honoring historical trauma, would that be part of our dialogue with Juana as we seek to repair the harm? And so just thinking about, we often think about this, I use the metaphor of the smog, just thinking about, I'm blanking on her name right now, but she wrote, "Why are all the Black kids sitting together at the cafeteria?" And she had some beautiful metaphors for how we are all kind of under the smog of actually thinking about white supremacy in some ways, of this legacy of historical trauma. And that as we are working on a chain underneath the caregiver's experience, we want to be aware of how this historical legacy shapes our view. So that when we're working with families, we're broadening from adverse childhood experiences to thinking about what are the adverse community experiences that Juana and Lydia and her partner have been through in terms of immigration stress, in terms of being viewed as others so that you can have your children taken from you, in terms of racism and oppression and neighborhood inequities. And also thinking about how do we hold that sometimes our lens is focused so on the negative because of this, and how do we really shift and hold also what we would call the BESES, the benevolent childhood experiences, and then recognize that even as we're viewing this interaction, if I'm thinking, why is Juana not doing this? Why is she this way? How am I interacting with her? And how is that affected by our cultural group's past history, so that I don't kind of replicate history in my interactions with her? So just to hold this, as we think about this, we have this cultural group experience. We have kind of the symptoms of that cultural group experience of racism, of systemic oppression, of avoidance of pain. And that we believe that in any good trauma treatment, part of what people need to do, we have these words, what do children need from a parent who has harmed them or failed to protect? They needed an acknowledgement, a clear statement that it was wrong, and really true evidence that we're working to change things. And we can apply that really to historical trauma. How do we acknowledge that in our bodies, in our words, in our actions? How do we feel the pain? How do we recognize the symptoms? And I just wanted to say that this is part of the context for CPP. I'm giving you a taste, a rapid taste in 15 minutes. But this changes what we would call our interpersonal neurobiology. It changes from moment one the way I interact, whether I sort of view myself as like, I may not be safe given the history. I have to earn safety when I work with you. So I know that my time is up, so I'm just going to pause there. I know we'll talk more when we are in the panel later on, but thank you.